The warm weight of Jason Ramos settling against his shoulder sent electricity coursing through Charles Lopez's entire body, his breath catching as his straight roommate's head found the perfect spot in the hollow of his neck. The shared headphones created an intimate cocoon around them, the soft jazz melody barely audible over the thundering of Charles's heart, as Jason's fingers accidentally brushed against his while adjusting the cord. This was dangerous territory, Charles knew, feeling the familiar ache of longing twist in his chest like a knife turning slowly. 3 months of careful friendship, 3 months of pretending that sharing an apartment with the most beautiful man he'd ever known wasn't slowly destroying him from the inside out. 3 months of watching Jason date a string of women who never seemed to appreciate the gentle way he made coffee in the mornings, or how his eyes crinkled when he laughed at his own terrible jokes. Jason shifted closer, his warm breath ghosting across Charles's collarbone as he murmured something about the saxophone solo, and Charles had to grip the couch cushion to keep from doing something catastrophically stupid, like turning his head and pressing his lips to Jason's temple. The scent of Jason's shampoo, something clean and woodsy that Charles had memorized despite himself, filled his lungs with every careful breath. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, suspended between friendship and something infinitely more terrifying, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when Charles first answered Jason's Craigslist ad for a roommate, never imagining that the confident voice on the phone belonged to someone who would turn his carefully ordered world completely upside down. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. It had started innocently enough, as these things always do. Charles had been desperate for affordable housing near campus, his graduate student stipend barely covering the basics, when Jason's listing appeared like an answer to prayers he hadn't dared voice. The apartment was perfect, a spacious 2-bedroom with hardwood floors and windows that caught the morning light. And Jason himself had seemed almost too good to be true during their brief phone conversation. When Charles showed up for the interview, portfolio clutched nervously in his sweaty palm, he'd been prepared for the usual roommate screening process. Questions about cleanliness, overnight guests, music volume. He hadn't been prepared for Jason to open the door looking like he'd stepped out of Charles's most secret fantasies, all tousled dark hair and easy smile, wearing a fitted t-shirt that showcased the kind of casual athleticism that made Charles's mouth go dry. Jason had invited him in with the kind of genuine warmth that Charles rarely encountered, offering coffee and settling into the conversation like they were old friends catching up, rather than strangers negotiating living arrangements. There was something magnetic about him, the way he listened with his whole body, leaning forward with interest when Charles talked about his thesis on urban architecture, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was actually paying attention. The apartment tour had been torture of the sweetest kind. Jason moving through the space with unconscious grace, pointing out amenities and quirks with the pride of someone who'd made this place truly home. His bedroom door had been open, offering a glimpse of rumpled sheets and books scattered across a nightstand, and Charles had to force himself to look away before his imagination could fill in too many details. By the time Jason offered him the room, Charles knew he was making a terrible mistake. Living with someone you're instantly attracted to is complicated enough when there's mutual interest. When that someone is demonstrably, obviously straight, evidenced by the framed photo of him with a stunning blonde that sat prominently on the kitchen counter, it becomes an exercise in beautiful self-destruction. But Charles had taken the room anyway, telling himself he could handle it, that he was mature enough to compartmentalize his feelings. He'd moved in on a sunny Saturday in September, Jason helping him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs with cheerful efficiency, making jokes about Charles's extensive book collection and the alarming number of coffee-making devices he'd accumulated. The first few weeks had been a delicate dance of boundaries and discoveries. Charles learned that Jason was a morning person who sang off-key in the shower, that he left coffee rings on the counter and always forgot to replace the toilet paper roll. He discovered that Jason was working toward his teaching certification, that he volunteered at a literacy center on weekends, that he had strong opinions about everything from pizza toppings to foreign policy. Jason, for his part, seemed genuinely interested in Charles as a person rather than just a convenient way to split the rent. He asked about Charles's research, listened to his complaints about difficult professors, remembered details about Charles's life that even some of his close friends forgot. There was an easiness to their cohabitation that Charles had never experienced with previous roommates, a natural rhythm that felt almost domestic in its comfort. The problem was that comfort bred intimacy, and intimacy bred hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing Charles could allow himself to feel. The shift began subtly, as these things always do. Jason's girlfriend, Melissa, the blonde from the photograph, started appearing less frequently. Their dinner conversations grew longer, stretching into the evening hours as they lingered over takeout containers and shared bottles of wine. Jason began seeking Charles out for advice about everything from lesson planning to relationship troubles. And Charles found himself in the uniquely torturous position of playing confidant to the object of his increasingly intense feelings. It was during one of these conversations, a rainy Thursday evening in November, that Charles first glimpsed the cracks in Jason's seemingly perfect heterosexual facade. They'd been discussing Jason's frustration with Melissa's apparent disinterest in anything deeper than surface-level conversation when Jason had paused mid-sentence, staring into his wine glass with an expression Charles couldn't quite decipher. "Can I ask you something?" Jason had said finally, his voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions? Like you're playing a part that doesn't quite fit?" The question had hit Charles like a physical blow, so close to his own daily experience of performing normalcy while dying inside. "What do you mean?" he'd managed to ask, proud of how steady his voice sounded. Jason had been quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass with deliberate focus. "I keep thinking there's supposed to be more. Like everyone talks about finding someone who completes you, or you always on completes you, but I've never felt that. Not with Melissa, not with anyone." He'd looked up then, meeting Charles's eyes with an intensity that made Charles's pulse stutter. "Maybe I'm just broken." "You're not broken," Charles had said immediately, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet." The conversation had moved on to safer topics after that, but something had shifted between them. Some invisible boundary had been crossed. Charles began noticing things he'd previously dismissed as wishful thinking. The way Jason's gaze would linger on him sometimes when he thought Charles wasn't looking. How Jason always seemed to find excuses to be in whatever room Charles was occupying. The increasing frequency of casual touches, hands brushing when they passed items back and forth. Jason's palm warm against Charles's shoulder when he laughed at something particularly funny. December brought final stress and the kind of emotional exhaustion that strips away pretense. Charles found himself working later and later in the library, partly because of academic pressure, but mostly because coming home to Jason's presence was becoming unbearable. The domestic intimacy of their shared space felt like a constant reminder of everything Charles wanted, but could never have. It was during one of these late library sessions that Charles received a text that changed everything. Jason's message was simple, just, "Are you coming home tonight?" But something about the phrasing made Charles's chest tight with a concern. He'd packed up immediately, abandoning his research to catch the last bus home. He'd found Jason on the couch in the dark, still wearing his work clothes but with his tie loosened and his hair mussed like he'd been running his hands through it. The television was on, but muted, casting flickering shadows across Jason's face as he stared blankly at the screen. "Hey," Charles had said softly, dropping his bag by the door. "Everything okay?" Jason had looked up with red-rimmed eyes and attempted a smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Melissa and I broke up." The words should have filled Charles with hope, but Jason looked so genuinely devastated that Charles felt nothing but concern. He'd settled onto the couch beside Jason, maintaining careful distance while offering what comfort he could. "I'm sorry," Charles had said, meaning it despite everything. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jason had been quiet for so long that Charles thought he wasn't going to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She said I was emotionally unavailable, that I never really let her in." He'd laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The thing is, she's right. I kept waiting to feel something real, something deep, but it never came. And the worst part is, I don't think it was about her specifically. I think there's something wrong with me. Charles's heart had broken a little at the raw pain in Jason's voice. There's nothing wrong with you, he'd said firmly. Sometimes people just aren't incompatible. That doesn't mean you're incapable of love. But what if I am? Jason had turned to face him fully then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. What if I'm just fundamentally broken in some way that means I'll never feel what other people feel? The conversation had continued deep into the night, Jason gradually opening up about his pattern of relationships that started with promise but always fizzled into disappointment. Charles had listened, offering reassurance and perspective while carefully avoiding any admission of his own feelings. It had been both the most wonderful and most torturous night of his life, being trusted with Jason's vulnerability while knowing he could never reciprocate with his own truth. That night had marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one characterized by increased emotional intimacy and physical proximity. Jason seemed to crave Charles's presence in a way that felt almost desperate, seeking him out for conversations that stretched long into the evening, suggesting shared meals and movie nights with increasing frequency. The headphone moment had been Jason's idea, proposed on a lazy Sunday afternoon when they'd both been trying to catch up on work, but finding themselves distracted by the neighbor's construction project. Jason had been attempting to grade papers while Charles worked on his thesis, but the constant drilling and hammering made concentration impossible. I have an idea, Jason had said, producing a pair of expensive noise-canceling headphones from his bedroom. These have a splitter. We could share them, put on some music, and actually get some work done. It had seemed innocent enough at the time. They'd settled on opposite ends of the couch, each with their respective work, sharing the soft, instrumental playlist Jason had selected. But somehow, gradually, they'd migrated toward each other. First, Jason had shifted closer to reach the coffee table more easily. Then Charles had moved to get better light from the window. Small adjustments that seemed practical, but resulted in them sitting side by side, thighs touching, sharing the intimate space created by the headphones. The music had been beautiful, some jazz compilation that Jason loved, but Charles had found himself unable to focus on anything except Jason's proximity. The way Jason's breathing had gradually synchronized with his own. How Jason's hand had come to rest on the couch cushion between them, fingers barely an inch from Charles's leg. The moment when Jason had let his head fall back against the couch and somehow ended up leaning against Charles's shoulder. That was where they were now, suspended in this perfect, terrible moment. Charles could feel every breath Jason took, could smell his shampoo and the faint scent of his cologne. Jason's weight against his shoulder felt like both a gift and a punishment, so close to what Charles wanted, but separated by an ocean of impossibility. "This is nice," Jason murmured, his voice soft and drowsy. "I feel more relaxed than I have in months." Charles's throat felt tight. "Yeah," he managed. "It's nice." They sat like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the music washing over them while Charles tried to memorize every detail of the moment, the way Jason's hair tickled against his neck, the warmth radiating from Jason's body where they touched, the steady rhythm of Jason's breathing that seemed to match the slow tempo of the saxophone on the playlist. It was Jason who broke the spell, lifting his head to look at Charles with an expression that was impossible to read. "Can I ask you something?" And he said, echoing the words from that conversation weeks ago. Charles's heart rate spiked, but he nodded. "Of course, with us." Jason was quiet for a moment, studying Charles's face with an intensity that made Charles want to look away. "Have you ever thought about kissing someone you shouldn't?" The question hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric. Charles felt his breath catch, his mind racing through possible responses. The safe answer, the one that would preserve their friendship and maintain the careful boundaries they'd established. Or the truth, which felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea how far the fall might be. "I think everyone has," Charles said finally, choosing the middle ground that was neither lie nor confession. Jason's eyes never left his face. "What about someone of the same gender?" Charles's world tilted on its axis. This was uncharted territory, dangerous ground that could destroy everything they'd built together. But there was something in Jason's expression, a vulnerability that reminded Charles of that night after the breakup, that made him choose honesty over safety. Yes, Charles said simply. Jason's breath seemed to catch. Really? Really? Charles's voice was barely above a whisper. Have you? The question seemed to surprise Jason, his eyes widening slightly before he looked away. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, he admitted, especially since Melissa and I broke up. I keep wondering if maybe that's why my relationships never work out. Maybe I've been looking for something in the wrong places. Charles felt like he was drowning and flying simultaneously. What do you mean? Jason turned back to face him, and Charles was struck by how young he looked suddenly, uncertain and searching. I mean, what if the reason I never felt that spark with any of my girlfriends wasn't because I'm broken, but because I was trying to force something that was never going to happen? The implications of Jason's words hung between them, too significant to ignore but too terrifying to acknowledge directly. Charles felt like they were standing at the edge of a precipice, one wrong word away from either salvation or destruction. Jason, Charles said carefully, what are you saying? Jason's hand moved on the couch cushion, his fingers finding Charles's and intertwining with them in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. I'm saying that sitting here with you, like this, feels more right than anything I've ever experienced with anyone else, and I'm terrified of what that might mean. Charles stared down at their joined hands, his pulse thundering in his ears. Terrified how? Terrified that I've been lying to myself for years. Terrified that I might be falling for my roommate who happens to be a man. Terrified that you might not feel the same way. Jason's voice cracked slightly on the last words. Terrified that I'm about to ruin the best friendship I've ever had. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, beautiful and terrifying in its implications. Charles felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jason had just revealed. All those months of careful distance, of protecting his heart while dying a little more each day, and now this. You're not going to ruin anything, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. And you're definitely not broken. Jason's grip on his hand tightened. How can you be so sure? Charles took a shaky breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between them, that there would be no going back once he spoke his truth. Because I've been in love with you since the day I moved in. Because watching you with other people has been the most beautiful torture I've ever experienced. Because every conversation we've had, every moment we've shared, has felt like the most natural thing in the world. Jason's eyes went wide, his lips parting in surprise. Charles, I know it's complicated, Charles rushed on, afraid that if he stopped talking, he'd lose his nerve. I know you've never been with a man before, and I know this changes everything between us. But you asked if I felt the same way, and I couldn't lie to you. Not anymore. For a moment, Jason just stared at him, processing the weight of Charles's confession. Then slowly a smile began to spread across his face, soft and wondering. 3 months, when he said quietly. You felt this way for 3 months and never said anything. I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. I didn't want to lose what we had. Jason's free hand came up to cup Charles's face, his thumb brushing across Charles's cheekbone with infinite tenderness. What we had was me being an idiot and you being too kind to tell me. All those nights when I couldn't figure out why and felt more comfortable talking to you than anyone I'd ever dated. All those times I found excuses to be near you, telling myself it was just because you're a good friend. Charles leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed. And now? Now I'm wondering how I could have been so blind. Jason's voice was soft, full of wonder. Now I'm thinking about how different my life might have been if I'd figured this out sooner. When Charles opened his eyes, Jason was looking at him with an expression of such tender affection that it took his breath away. What happens now? Charles asked. Now, Jason said, leaning closer until their foreheads were nearly touching. I'd really like to find out what it feels like to kiss you. Charles's heart stopped. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The kiss, when it came, was everything Charles had dreamed of and nothing like he'd expected. Soft at first, tentative and questioning, Jason's lips warm and gentle against his own. Then, as Charles responded with barely contained longing, it deepened into something more urgent, more certain. Jason's hand tightened in Charles's hair, while Charles gripped the front of Jason's shirt, pulling him closer, afraid that if he let go, this perfect moment would dissolve like a dream. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jason rested his forehead against Charles's and smiled. "Wow," he breathed. "Yeah," Charles managed, his voice hoarse. "Wow." They sat like that for a moment, foreheads touching, sharing breath and space in the overwhelming realization that everything had changed. The headphones had long since been forgotten, the music playing unheard as they navigated this new reality. "I'm scared," Jason admitted quietly. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be with a man." Charles's heart ached with tenderness for this brave, vulnerable person who had just turned his world upside down in the best possible way. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "We can take it slow. We can learn together." Jason pulled back to look at him, his eyes bright with the unshed tears of relief. "You'd be willing to do that? To be patient with me while I figure out who I am?" "Jason," Charles said, his voice full of quiet conviction, "I'd wait forever if that's what you needed." The smile that spread across Jason's face was radiant, transforming his features with pure joy. "I don't think it'll take forever," he said, leaning in to brush another soft kiss across Charles's lips. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The days that followed were a revelation. Jason approached his sexual awakening with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else, asking questions with endearing directness and seeking affection with a hunger that suggested years of emotional starvation. They moved slowly as Charles had promised, but even the smallest intimacies felt monumental. The first time Jason reached for Charles's hand while they watched television, intertwining their fingers with deliberate intention rather than nervous exploration, Charles felt his heart swell with such fierce tenderness he could barely breathe. The first time Jason kissed him goodbye before leaving for work, casual and domestic and beautifully normal, Charles had to lean against the closed door for several minutes to collect himself. They talked constantly during those early days, Jason processing years of confusion and misunderstood feelings, while Charles marveled at having his deepest longings not only acknowledged, but reciprocated. Jason told him about the subtle wrongness he'd felt in every heterosexual relationship, the sense of performing rather than experiencing genuine attraction. Charles shared his own journey of self-discovery, the years of hiding and hoping and learning to love himself despite a world that often suggested he shouldn't. The physical progression was slow and sweet, each new level of intimacy negotiated with careful communication and enthusiastic consent. Jason was endearingly nervous the first time Charles kissed his neck, shivering under the attention with a responsiveness that made Charles's head spin. The first time they fell asleep together, fully clothed but tangled together on Charles's bed after a long evening of conversation and gentle kisses, Charles woke to find Jason watching him with an expression of such soft affection that it brought tears to his eyes. "Good mornings," Jason had whispered, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Charles had whispered back, reaching up to smooth Jason's bedhead with gentle fingers. "I could get used to this," Jason had said, leaning into the touch like a cat seeking affection. "I hope you do." The conversation with Jason's family came 3 weeks into their relationship, a phone call that Charles only heard one side of, but that left Jason shaky and emotional afterward. His parents, it seemed, were struggling with the news but ultimately committed to maintaining their relationship with their son. His sister, Jason reported with a tearful smile, had apparently said she'd been wondering when he'd figure it out. "She said she never understood why I dated such boring women," Jason told Charles later, curled against his side on the couch. "Apparently my taste in girlfriends was a family joke." Charles laughed, pressing a kiss to the top of Jason's head. "I can't say I disagree with her assessment." "Hey," Jason protested, but he was smiling. "Some of them were very nice." "I'm sure they were. They just weren't right for you." Jason tilted his head to look up at him. "And you are?" "I hope so," Charles said honestly. I want to be. You are, Jason said with quiet certainty. You're exactly right for me. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to figure it out. The semester ended with a flurry of finals and deadlines, but even academic stress couldn't diminish the joy Charles felt in their newfound relationship. Jason was an affectionate partner, generous with physical touch and words of encouragement, seemingly making up for lost time in his expressions of care and attraction. He left little notes in Charles's textbooks, brought him coffee during late-night study sessions, and had developed a habit of kissing Charles's temple whenever he passed his chair at the kitchen table. It was during one of these study sessions, Charles bent over his laptop while Jason graded papers nearby, that Jason asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. What happens when the lease is up? Jason said quietly, not looking up from his work. Charles's fingers stilled on the keyboard. They'd been so focused on navigating the immediate reality of their relationship that they hadn't discussed the practical implications. The lease renewal was due in 2 months, and while Charles had assumed they'd continue living together, he realized they'd never actually talked about it. What do you want to happen? Charles asked carefully. Jason set down his pen and looked at him directly. I want us to sign a new lease together, not as roommates, but as partners. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. Are you sure? It's only been a few weeks. You don't have to rush into anything just because. Charles, Jason interrupted gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. I know it's fast. I know I'm still figuring out parts of myself, but I also know that what I feel for you isn't going anywhere. This isn't some experimental phase or quarter-life crisis. This is me finally understanding what love is supposed to feel like. The words hit Charles like a physical blow, beautiful and overwhelming in their sincerity. Love, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. Yes, love. I'm in love with you, Charles. I think I have been for months. I was just too stupid to recognize it. Charles felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of hearing those words from Jason's lips. I love you too, he managed. So much it scares me sometimes. Jason's smile was radiant. Scared how? Scared that this is too good to be true. Scared that I'll wake up and find out I dreamed all of this. Jason stood and moved around the table, pulling Charles up into his arms. Not a dream, he murmured against Charles's ear. This is real. We're real. Charles melted into the embrace, burying his face in Jason's neck and breathing in the familiar scent that had become synonymous with home. I want to sign that lease with you, he said. I want to build a life with you too. They held each other in the kitchen light, swaying slightly as if dancing to music only they could hear. Charles marveled at how perfectly Jason fit in his arms, how right this felt after months of careful distance and suppressed longing. There's something else, Jason said eventually, pulling back to look at Charles with an expression that was part nervous, part excited. I've been thinking about coming out more publicly. To my coworkers, my friends. I don't want to hide us. I'm tired of living in the shadows. Charles's heart swelled with pride and love for this brave, beautiful man who had turned his world upside down in the best possible way. Are you sure you're ready for that? I'm sure, Jason said firmly. I spent years pretending to be someone I'm not, and I'm done with that. I want the world to know that I'm with the most amazing man I've ever met. The coming out process was gradual but steady. Jason told his coworkers first, during a casual conversation about weekend plans that somehow evolved into him mentioning his boyfriend. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several colleagues expressing happiness for him and one admitting that she'd always suspected Jason might be gay. His friends took the news with varying degrees of surprise, but ultimately rallied around him with support and acceptance. Charles met them gradually, nervous about being scrutinized as the man who had supposedly turned Jason gay, but finding instead a group of people who seemed genuinely happy to see Jason so obviously content. The first time Jason introduced Charles as his boyfriend in public, at a casual dinner with friends, Charles felt a surge of pride and belonging that nearly brought him to tears. To be claimed so openly, so proudly, after months of hiding his feelings, felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. Their relationship deepened as spring arrived, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings and endless possibility. They signed the lease renewal with ceremony, Jason insisting they needed to celebrate this milestone with champagne and takeout from their favorite restaurant. They rearranged the apartment to better reflect their coupled status, combining their belongings and creating shared spaces that felt truly theirs. The physical aspect of their relationship progressed naturally, each new level of intimacy feeling both inevitable and miraculous. Jason's enthusiasm for exploration was matched by his tenderness, his desire to please balanced by his willingness to communicate his own needs and boundaries. Charles had never experienced such open, honest intimacy, the kind that came from being with someone who loved him completely and without reservation. It was during one of their lazy Sunday mornings, tangled together in bed with coffee and newspapers scattered around them, that Jason brought up the future with characteristic directness. "I've been thinking about graduate school," he said, tracing patterns on Charles's chest with gentle fingers. "There's a program in educational psychology that I'm interested in. It would mean 2 more years of school, but I think it's what I want to do." Charles looked down at him with interest. "Where's the program?" "Here, actually. At the university. I could stay in the city, keep my job at the literacy center part-time." Jason paused, suddenly uncertain. "That is, if you think it's a good idea, if you want me to stay." Charles's heart clenched with tenderness for this man who still sometimes seemed surprised by the depth of Charles's commitment to their relationship. "Jason," he said gently, "I want you to pursue whatever makes you happy. And yes, I want you to stay. I want us to build a future here together." Jason's smile was brilliant. "Really? Really? I can't imagine my life without you in it." They talked about their dreams that morning, sharing visions of the future that seemed suddenly achievable now that they were facing it together. Jason's graduate school plans, Charles's dissertation defense and job search, the possibility of travel and adventure, and all the ordinary moments that make up a life shared with someone you love. The months that followed were a study in domestic bliss, punctuated by the usual stresses of academic life and career building. Jason applied to graduate school with Charles's enthusiastic support, spending hours perfecting his application essays while Charles provided feedback and encouragement. Charles defended his dissertation proposal to a committee that seemed genuinely impressed with his research, a moment of professional triumph made sweeter by Jason's presence in the audience. Beaming with pride, they developed routines and traditions, small rituals that marked their growing commitment to each other. Sunday morning coffee in bed became sacred, a time for planning their week and sharing dreams and fears. They took turns cooking dinner, Jason's enthusiastic but chaotic approach to the kitchen providing endless entertainment for Charles, who preferred precise measurements and careful timing. The first time they said, "I love you" in public was at a university function, Charles introducing Jason to his advisor with obvious pride. The words slipped out naturally, Charles describing Jason as the man I love, without even thinking about it. Jason's smile had been radiant, his hand finding Charles's and squeezing gently in acknowledgement of the milestone. Jason's acceptance to graduate school came on a Tuesday in March, the phone call arriving while Charles was in class. He came home to find Jason dancing around the kitchen, acceptance letter in hand, and tears of joy streaming down his face. The celebration that followed was enthusiastic and thorough, involving champagne, takeout from 3 different restaurants, and hours of talking about the future that was suddenly concrete and real. 2 more years, Jason said, curled against Charles's side later that evening. 2 more years, and then we'll both be done with school. We can start the next chapter of our lives. "Any thoughts on what that chapter might look like?" Charles asked, pressing a kiss to Jason's hair. Jason was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want us to get a place together. A real place. Not just an apartment we're sharing, but a home we're building. I want a garden and a bush and say Sunday dinners with friends. I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life." Charles's throat tightened with emotion. "That sounds perfect." "Really?" "Really. Although I have one addition to that vision. Jason lifted his head to look at him with curiosity. What's that? Charles took a deep breath, his heart racing with the magnitude of what he was about to say. I want to marry you someday when you're ready, when we're both ready. I want to make this official in every way possible. Jason's eyes went wide, his lips parting in surprise. You want to marry me? I want to marry you, Charles confirmed, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. I want to stand in front of our friends and family and promise to love you for the rest of my life. I want to wear a ring that tells the world I'm yours. I want to build a life with you that's so beautiful and real that we never doubt how right this is. Jason's response was to kiss him, deep and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jason rested his forehead against Charles's and smiled. Ask me again in 2 years, he said softly. When we're both done with school and ready to start that next chapter, ask me then and I'll say yes. Charles felt his heart swell with such fierce love and joy that he could barely contain it. Is that a promise? That's a promise, Jason said, sealing it with another kiss that tasted like forever. The rest of their time in graduate school passed in a blur of shared goals and mutual support. They navigated the stresses of academic life together, celebrating each other's successes and providing comfort during moments of doubt or frustration. Jason thrived in his program, his natural empathy and communication skills making him a favorite among both professors and fellow students. Charles completed his dissertation with Jason as his most dedicated reader and cheerleader, offering feedback and encouragement through every revision. They grew together as a couple, learning each other's rhythms and needs, developing the kind of easy intimacy that comes from complete trust and acceptance. Their fights were rare and quickly resolved, usually stemming from stress rather than fundamental disagreements. Their love deepened with time and familiarity, becoming less desperate and more settled. The kind of steady affection that forms the foundation of a lifetime partnership. The day Charles defended his dissertation, Jason was there in the front row, beaming with pride as Charles fielded questions from his committee with confidence and expertise. The defense was successful, Charles's research earning praise and approval that opened doors to several promising job opportunities. That evening, they celebrated with dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first official date, toasting Charles's achievement and the bright future that stretched ahead of them. Jason raised his glass with characteristic warmth, his eyes bright with love and admiration. To Dr. Charles Lopez, he said solemnly, the smartest, most dedicated man I know, I'm so proud of you. Charles felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Jason's support and the reality of how far they'd come together. To us, he said, raising his own glass, to building something beautiful together. 2 years later, on a warm Saturday morning in May, Charles woke to find Jason already awake beside him, watching him with the soft expression that still made his heart skip after all this time. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their new apartment, the one they'd chosen together with careful consideration of neighborhood and natural light and the possibility of a small garden on the balcony. Good morning, Jason murmured, reaching up to smooth Charles's sleep-mussed hair. Good morning, Charles replied, leaning into the touch that had become as natural as breathing. What time is it? Early still. I was just thinking. About what? Jason's smile was soft and wondering. About how different my life is now compared to where I thought it would be. About how grateful I am that you answered my roommate ad, about how perfect this feels. Charles's heart swelled with familiar tenderness. Any regrets? Only that it took me so long to figure it out, Jason said, echoing words from years earlier. But then again, maybe we needed that time. Maybe we needed to become who we are before we could be together like this. Charles considered this, thinking about their journey from strangers to roommates to friends to lovers to partners. Maybe you're right. Maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the lazy luxury of a weekend morning with nowhere they needed to be. Jason had graduated the previous week, his thesis defense as successful as Charles's had been 2 years earlier. Charles had accepted a position at a local architecture firm, work that challenged him intellectually while allowing him to contribute to the city he'd grown to love. They were both officially done with school, ready to begin the next chapter Jason had envisioned all those months ago. Charles, Jason said eventually, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement that made Charles look at him more closely. Yeah? Jason took a deep breath, his cheeks flushing slightly, in the way they still did when he was feeling particularly vulnerable. Remember what you said about marriage? About asking me again when we were both done with school? Charles's pulse quickened, his heart beginning to race with anticipation and hope. I remember. Well, we're both done with school now, Jason said, his voice soft but steady. And I've been thinking about it a lot lately. About what it would mean to make this official, to stand up in front of everyone we love and promise to spend our lives together. Charles felt his breath catch, hardly daring to hope that this conversation was going where he thought it might be. And what did you decide? Jason's smile was radiant, transforming his face with pure joy. I decided that I don't want to wait for you to ask me. I want to ask you. He sat up suddenly, reaching into the drawer of his nightstand and pulling out a small velvet box that made Charles's heart stop entirely. Charles Lopez, will you marry me? Charles stared at the piece, then at Jason's face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. You're serious. I'm completely serious, Jason said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant band that caught the morning light beautifully. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. I want to spend the rest of my life waking up next to you, building dreams with you, growing old with you. Will you marry me? Charles felt tears spring into his eyes, his throat tight with emotion. Yes, he managed, his voice hoarse with feeling. Yes, of course. Yes. Jason's whoop of joy was loud enough to wake the neighbors, but Charles didn't care. He was too busy being kissed by his fiancée, too overwhelmed by the perfect rightness of this moment to worry about anything else. The ring slipped onto his finger with surprising ease, as if it had been made specifically for him, which Jason later admitted it had been. How long have you been planning this? Charles asked, admiring the way the ring caught the light. Months, Jason confessed, looking slightly embarrassed. I bought the ring in February, but I wanted to wait until we were both officially done with school. I wanted this to be the beginning of our next chapter, not the end of our last one. Charles kissed him again, deep and thorough and full of promise. I love you so much, he murmured against Jason's lips. I love you too, Jason replied, more than words can express. They spent the morning in bed, making love with the desperate tenderness of people who had found their home in each other, who understood the precious rarity of what they shared. Later, they called their families and friends, sharing the news with voices bright with happiness and receiving congratulations that ranged from tearful to exuberant. The wedding planning process was surprisingly smooth, both men having clear ideas about what they wanted their celebration to look like. They chose a small venue with a garden setting, invited only their closest family and friends, and focused on creating an event that reflected their personalities and their love story rather than conforming to traditional expectations. Jason's parents, who had struggled initially with his coming out, had grown to genuinely love Charles over the years, welcoming him into their family with warmth and acceptance. Charles's own family, smaller but equally supportive, embraced Jason with enthusiasm and gratitude for the happiness he'd brought their son. The ceremony itself was held on a perfect October afternoon, the autumn light golden and warm as it filtered through the trees. Charles stood at the altar in his carefully chosen suit, watching Jason walk down the aisle with tears in his eyes and wonder in his heart. Jason looked radiant, his smile bright enough to power the city, his eyes never leaving Charles's face as he made his way to the front of the gathering. Their vows were personal and heartfelt, each man speaking honestly about their journey together and their hopes for the future. Charles talked about the miracle of finding love in the most unexpected place, about the gift of being seen and accepted completely by another person. Jason spoke about discovering himself through loving Charles, about the courage it had taken to embrace his truth and the joy he'd found in building a life with his best friend and greatest love. When they kissed as married men, the cheers from their gathered loved ones were loud enough to startle the birds from the trees. But Charles barely heard them, too focused on the feel of Jason's lips against his, the solid reality of the ring on his finger, the overwhelming rightness of this moment they'd worked so hard to reach. The reception was intimate and joyful, filled with laughter and dancing and toasts that ranged from hilarious to deeply moving. Charles's advisor gave a speech about the power of love to transform lives, while Jason's sister told embarrassing stories about his dating history that had everyone laughing until they cried. But the moment that stayed with Charles was quieter, more private. Late in the evening, when most of their guests had gone home and they were finally alone, Jason had taken his hand and led him out to the garden where they had exchanged vows hours earlier. "How do you feel?" Jason asked, pulling Charles into his arms under the stars. "Perfect," Charles said honestly. "Complete. Like everything in my life has been leading to this moment." Jason's smile was soft and wondering. "I keep thinking about that first day, when you came to look at the apartment. If someone had told me then that I'd be marrying you 3 years later, I would have thought they were crazy. And now I think it was inevitable," Jason said, leaning in to kiss Charles softly. "I think we were always meant to find each other, even if it took us a while to figure out what that meant." Charles thought about their journey, about the careful dance of friendship and longing, the moment of confession that had changed everything, the slow building of trust and love that had brought them to this place. "I'm glad it happened the way it did," he said. "I'm glad we took our time. It made this even more precious." "No regrets?" Jason asked, echoing Charles's question from that morning months ago. "Only that we can't do it all over again," Charles said, making Jason laugh. They danced in the garden until the venue staff politely suggested it was time to leave, then drove home to the apartment that was no longer just a shared space but the foundation of their married life. They made love as husbands for the first time, tender and passionate and full of promises for all the years ahead. Later, lying tangled together in the darkness, Charles reflected on the miraculous turns his life had taken. 3 years ago, he'd been a lonely graduate student answering a roommate ad out of financial necessity. Now he was married to the love of his life, building a future that surpassed even his most optimistic dreams. "Jason," he whispered into the darkness. "Hmm?" Jason's response was drowsy, content. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to ask about the headphones that day, for leaning against me, for taking the risk of telling me how you felt, for choosing love even when it was scary." Jason lifted his head to look at him, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Thank you for being patient with me, for loving me even when I was too stupid to love you back properly, for making me feel safe enough to discover who I really am." Charles pulled him closer, overwhelmed once again by the depth of his love for this brave, beautiful man who had transformed his life so completely. "Here's to the next chapter," he murmured. "Here's to forever," Jason replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted like home. And as they fell asleep in each other's arms, Charles marveled at how a simple request to share headphones had led to this perfect life, this love that had grown from the most ordinary moment into something extraordinary. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the smallest gestures, the quietest invitations to come closer, to share space and breath and the vulnerable territory of the heart. Sometimes all it took was the courage to lean in, to trust, to let yourself be known by another person completely. Then they were both exactly where they needed to be.